justice and the American way. We are the Voices of Dissent.
Welcome to the Voices of Dissent live from Fort Wayne, Indiana. I am Justin McKenzie, joined by Ric Runsteadt and Marc Jernigan, executive producer Joe Walburn, and BJ Steele manning the studio for us. Today we have an exciting show lined up for you. Stephen Halbrook will be joining us momentarily. Larry Clayman will be on later on in the hour. Stacy O'Day, the county assessor here in Allen County, will also be on later. And Dean of Indiana Tech Law School, Dean Andre Douglas Pine Cummings, will be on to join us and talk about Indiana Tech as well. But right now, I would like to welcome to the program Stephen Halbrook, who is a constitutional expert and research fellow of the Independent Institute. He has a brand new book out, Gun Control in the Third Reich, Disarming the Jews and Enemies of the State. Mr. Halbrook is a renowned constitutional expert and Second Amendment champion. He has taken multiple cases before the Supreme Court and even getting part of the Brady bill declared unconstitutional. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Halbrook.
My pleasure to be on the show. Thank you.
Hey, we were talking about, before the show, we were talking about how America has a gun culture. And if you take all of the expenditures of the private citizens in this country, we form the 5th largest military in the world. Tell us about how you became passionate about the Second Amendment and protecting Americans' rights to own guns.
Well, it became clear to me. I was an undergraduate in college at Florida State University back in the mid-'60s, and there was a lot of things going on in our country in that time, political turmoil, riots, and in Congress there were gun control bills being proposed, and I started to do a little bit of research on the Second Amendment, and I found that there was no scholarship to speak of that had ever been published in the legal community or elsewhere. And I got interested in it at that time and started doing my research and began to publish law review articles, and that developed into books.
It's an amazing background, Mr. Halbrook. I commend you on your patriotism. I thank you for the defense of my Second Amendment. My name is Marc Jernigan. I'm a certified public accountant in Fort Wayne, and I growing up as a kid, I grew up in an urban community. There were no guns in my house as a kid, and I kind of thought they were bad. And as I moved through my mid-20s, and I started to have kids, you realize that the usefulness of the phrase that I don't carry a gun because I'm afraid, I carry a gun so I don't have to be afraid, comes into play. And it's amazing that you have done so much work regarding the defense of our Second Amendment. And I wanted to give you a big thank you very much, sir.
Well, you're welcome, and it shows you how whether you live in an urban or a rural society frequently influences how you think about guns. Where I grew up, it was a small farming community. There were guns all over the place, and there was no violence to speak of. And they were very common, and they were not evil. We went hunting. I was in the junior NRA at summer camp. We had single-shot rifles, .22 caliber, and we learned gun safety, and it was just a normal part of life. So we weren't just watching guns on TV and seeing misuse of guns. They were just ordinary articles of life. And when all these proposals started coming out of Congress and then at the state and local levels as well, to ban guns, it was a pretty phenomenal uprooting of traditional American culture. And I think that led to a reaction, certainly influenced me to get involved in Second Amendment rights.
Absolutely. You wrote a book, The Founders' Second Amendment. It's a little background, from my perspective, it's background for your current book, Gun Control in the Third Reich. Can you give us a little background on the Founders' Second Amendment? Because when we talk about America and its gun culture, it really traces all the way back to the founding of the country, and it hasn't left. So I considered that book background as a foundation for where the culture is. Can you give us some historical perspective on what did the founders think?
Well, I had published previous books. My first one was called That Every Man Be Armed, The Evolution of a Constitutional Right. But I wanted to do a book solely on the founding period, basically beginning in 1768 when the British troops were first sailing to Boston, and the colonists thought that they were coming to disarm them and to take them away to England to be tried and not have jury of their peers, all those kinds of rights that ended up in the Bill of Rights. And the book ends when the last one of the founders died. So here you have the founding period. What did they think? What were the British doing to them in terms of disarming the inhabitants? How did they fight back in the Revolution? What rights did they declare? It started in 1776 when the states were first formed as independent states, and they were declaring rights and bills of rights. That's where the right to bear arms first appears in our constitutional tradition. And then moving on into the development of the Second Amendment, there's been a lot of denial in the years before, claims that the Second Amendment was a collective state militia right and had nothing to do with individuals, and it was basically a big lie that was created by certain legal circles and adopted by many courts. But the Supreme Court laid that to rest in D.C. versus Heller in 2008. But in any event, the Founders' Second Amendment was a historical account of how the founders viewed this right and how important they thought it was.
Stephen, Ric Runsteadt here. In my readings about this, one of the things that they indicate was very important to the founders with regards to the Second Amendment was that in Europe, the nobles had firearms. The nobles could carry around weapons, but the peasants couldn't. And the concept of a free society with free men and free women that are equal from a legal standpoint was so very critical, and the way to ensure that, as well as obviously protect our freedoms and our liberties that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights give us, is to make sure that not just the powerful are able to be armed, but the powerless as well. In your research, did you come across evidence that indicated that as well?
Well, certainly that was the case throughout Europe. And if we look at the English tradition, we see in the final years of the absolute monarch period, James II, for example, depriving Protestants of firearms, seizing them, confiscating them, issuing search warrants to seize all firearms from selected individuals, political enemies, and extensive hunting regulations that tried to prevent ordinary people from having firearms. And so when the Glorious Revolution took place in 1689, the English Declaration of Rights declared the right of Protestants to have arms, and that right was expanded in the colonies, though it was the right of all persons to have arms and to have them to protect self and family and against criminals, and also for protection of basic rights, the rights of Englishmen, they were called at the time, and that meant going against the crown when it tried to violate those rights.
No, it's amazing that it's amazing that it goes that our right to bear arms goes back that far. It truly sets the foundation and the footer for the house that gets built of the United States of America with an unabashed gun culture, and I don't mean that, and I don't mean that in the popular video game perspective. I mean it as in when you grew up on the farm, where firearms are a tool, and they're part of everyday life. That's what I mean by a firearm culture. Europe, and I'd love to transition into your newest book, the Gun Control in the Third Reich. Europe didn't have a gun culture that the United States of America had. So when the Weimar Republic passed their law, that essentially, wow, I mean, it's extremely difficult. You're going to have to wrap it up. The Weimar Republic came along and said no. It was really from that foundation that the Nazis built the entire gun control into political control house that they.
Right. There was never a tradition that you had a constitutional right to have a gun, because you had what James Madison called the culture where the monarchs were afraid to trust the people with arms, unlike in the American colonies at the time. And so you had no sense of a right, and you don't have necessarily widespread gun ownership. You certainly had more in rural areas, in Germany, France, countries like that, but you still had a lot of restrictions. And after the Great War in Germany, there was a lot of political violence, the commies against the Nazis, and both trying to seize power by means of violence. And so you had a great gun control debate, just the same arguments that you hear today.
They really were the same arguments too, sir, right?
Yeah, they were identical. I mean, those who wanted to ban certain guns and require registration and licensing of gun owners thought that would do some good. The opponents of that said, look, criminals and political extremists don't go by these laws. Just law-abiding people do that. So what have you accomplished by all these restrictions other than making criminals out of law-abiding people? So that was the debate, and the gun control side won the debate. So in 1928, a gun law was passed requiring extensive licensing to acquire guns, to carry guns, and then in 1931, registration of firearms was decreed by the Weimar Republic, with the warning, however, by the Interior Minister, do not let the registration records fall into the wrong hands, the hands of extremist elements. And not long after that warning took place in 1933, the first of the year, Adolf Hitler took power. And the registration records fell right into the wrong hands, and they immediately used these records to disarm their political opponents. And who would that be? All the political parties that were not Nazi parties. So you had the Social Democrats, the Liberals, conservative parties, even those folks were being disarmed, and the Nazis knew who had the guns because they had the registration list. So the ultimate extremist group took power, and they were able to consolidate their power very quickly through the use of that the Weimar Republic's own gun laws. Added to that a lot of police overreach and brutality. The brown shirts basically went crazy, beating people up in the streets. I mean, the violence that took place once Hitler came to power was phenomenal.
Well, and we're coming up on the 76th anniversary of the Night of the Broken Glass, and something you mentioned in an article you wrote last year was that this government was able to use the registrations of firearms to disarm the populace so that they could enact all of this crazy things that they were doing in the Nazi regime. How, with all the similarities between them and us now, what could they have done to prevent them being disarmed, and what can we do today?
Well, it goes back to 1933 first. The main focus was on disarming political enemies, although the Nazis did disarm Jews to some extent, but not as extensively as later, because during the 30s you had this ratcheting up of measures against the Jewish people. You had the Nuremberg laws, which deprived them of many rights, civil rights and citizenship rights. And then they started wanting to expropriate their assets. In fact, the first expropriation of a major business in Germany by the National Socialists was Simon and Company, or Simpson and Company.
Simpson and Company, the firearm manufacturers.
Firearm manufacturer.
Yeah, they were owned by a Jewish family, weren't they?
That's right. There were two Jewish brothers, and basically they were taken into Gestapo custody, accused of crimes that they didn't commit, and forced to surrender their company. So, but in the fall of 1938, in September, October, you have the disarming of the Jewish population. Berlin Police Chief Count Helldorf was in charge of that in Berlin, and that was going on for several weeks. And why was that going on? All the evidence points to the fact that a major action against the Jewish population was being planned by the Nazis.
Yeah, absolutely. The one most impressive piece of the book, of your book, the Gun Control in the Third Reich, sir, the most impressive piece of it was your knowledge of the Nazi hierarchy. What an unbelievable amount of work. I did a little bit of work on it last night. Wilhelm Frick, the Interior Minister, what an unbelievable guy he was. You give that guy the power to take guns away, and he was an unbelievable asset to Hitler. Him and what there's one other guy that was with Hitler from the start to the finish. Wilhelm Frick, and I can't say the other guy's name. It's long and German. But it was an amazing. You give that guy that amount of power, and he just took it and ran with it.
Yeah, Frick was the equivalent to our Attorney General, and so he was in charge of drafting Hitler's gun control law that was passed in 1938, which frankly wasn't much different than the Weimar law, other than it prohibited Jews from being participants in the firearms industry. But in any event, I think that one of the strongest parts of the book historically is the fact that is shown, and historians have not recognized it. When the Night of the Broken Glass took place, beginning November the 9th, 1938. That was an onslaught against the Jewish people. There was a pretext. There had been a young Polish teenager who was Jewish. He shot a member of the staff of the German embassy in Paris. That was the pretext to attack the German Jews generally. But they had been disarming them for weeks before that. So it's obvious that Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, was planned in advance. There was no other reason why the Jews were being disarmed. And once they were disarmed, the attack came. Synagogues were burned, houses were broken into, businesses were vandalized. 20,000 Jewish men were taken into custody. They had to pay ransom to be released. So you had this horrible crime committed against the German Jews. Himmler, the head of the SS, decreed 20 years in the concentration camp for a Jew caught in possession of a gun.
One of the things that's the most amazing to me is whether you look at Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or Fidel Castro's Cuba, every single totalitarian country ever throughout history wants to disarm its victims over and over and over again. And also the biggest advocates consistently everywhere for gun control are always the same people who advocate total state control and state power. The socialists in the United States who want to see the government grow and grow and grow and get more invasive in our life. They want the NSA bugging our phones. Those are the very same people who want to disarm the people. Do you find it amazing that when we look throughout history that disarmament is oftentimes followed with total tyranny, that people don't sit there and ask themselves, maybe they really aren't trying to just keep us safe. Maybe this is a move, obviously, by people who want to have total government control over the people.
Well, it's inconsistent with dictatorship, totalitarian, authoritarianism, with those systems of government to just allow the people to possess guns freely. And the idea that Hitler was the gun owner's best friend, you'll see that argument made on the internet by people with no sense of history, that they denied that this happened. They denied that gun control had anything to do with the Nazi regime and its consolidation of power. And you've even had attempts by legal scholars to say that. So it's a pretextual argument because they see the implications for that today. If it's the case that gun control in the form we're talking about, and we're not talking about disarming criminals, we're talking about disarming law-abiding people, if that historically is associated with authoritarian government, that has an implication for today. Like, we should be forewarned. We should be very careful in what kinds of laws are passed. But historically, it's just undeniable as to what happened, and it's almost like a subscript of denying that the Holocaust or a part of it happened. I mean, the Jews were disarmed before they were subjected to the violence, tyranny, and to the death camps, as were many ordinary Germans who were not Jewish, but they were political opponents of the National Socialists. I mean, many of them were taken into custody and mistreated, and they were always disarmed beforehand. That's the way dictatorships operate.
We're visiting with Stephen Halbrook here on the Voices of Dissent. This hour is brought to you by Tax Matter Solutions. If the IRS is trying to disarm your business, give Mark a call at 877-489-8999. That's 877-489-8999. Hey, Mr. Halbrook, we were talking about the current gun laws, etc. What role do you see government having in an appropriate role of regulating firearms in this country? Is there any?
Well, certainly nobody wants the bad guys to have guns, and so commit a crime with a gun and go to prison for a long time.
Okay, that sounds reasonable.
The most important thing of all, not to let them out, keep them off the streets, and instead we have this focus in some jurisdictions, some states. We all know who they are. It's New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, California.
Illinois.
They want to overly restrict law-abiding people. They want to ban any kind of gun. They want to ban, they call it a so-called assault weapon. They want to have extensive record-keeping on law-abiding people. They want to make it a felony if your papers are not in order, so to speak.
Yeah,
if you don't have the right registration papers. Washington, D.C. is a good example of that. So,
yeah.
but the focus is misplaced. You're using all that energy to hurt law-abiding people, to make it hard for them to defend their families and their homes, and you're basically not using those resources that could be used against violent crime.
Absolutely, and I think if our listeners would like to join the conversation, they give us a call at 969-1250. That's 969-1250.
Yeah, and again, when we look at this, the argument that is so oftentimes made today is we need to disarm everyone because then we'll all be safe. Once the government has all the guns and the people are completely at the mercy of the government, then it'll be wonderful because there won't be any more homicides, crime, what have you. But if we look at
That's exactly what the Nazis used.
Sure, but it's what they.
The police will
use.
protect you. They have guns. It's okay.
Yeah, and periodically we have shootings, and it's always the same thing. Oh, this would never happen if we simply disarmed the people. But here's the thing. We have Switzerland, where the homicide rate per 100,000 is 0.6. It's 0.6. It is almost nothing. And here the 21 to 34-year-olds have machine guns in their houses. And until 2008, they had to have 50 rounds of ammo. So in a country where everybody's got a machine gun, there's almost no homicides. It's 4.8 most recently in the United States. But if we look at countries like Honduras, El Salvador, Belize, countries where there is incredibly strict, if not total, gun control, we have homicide rates that are 21.5, 44.6, 90.1. We have homicide rates that are absolutely astronomical where the people are disarmed. And in a country like Switzerland, where gun ownership is ubiquitous, we have almost no homicide rates. How is it, and we had that wonderful book by John Lott, More Guns, Less Crime, how is it that they continue to shill the same lies that they've been shilling for literally centuries now, and that there's anyone who'd actually believe it in the face of absolutely overwhelming data and evidence to the contrary?
Well, the Swiss model shows also the viability of an armed populace to dissuade invasion from abroad. You look at a map of the Third Reich from World War II, it extended into North Africa, into Russia, and all of continental Europe just about.
Except for that center in the middle.
That little white dot, Switzerland. I have two books I wrote, actually, Target Switzerland and the Swiss and the Nazis. And it was clear in the Germans did have invasion plans for Switzerland, but it was clear that they thought the cost in blood would be too high. There were plans to basically try to slow down an invasion at the border, but then the Swiss would have been concentrated in the Alps, and that was a place where the Panthers and the Luftwaffe could not have been effective. It would have been a guerrilla warfare of the worst kind, and the Germans needed every troop they could get for the Russian campaign. So, the Swiss model, I think, refutes the idea that it's a criminal society is produced by law-abiding people having guns, and instead also shows that you don't have a tyranny in those kinds of countries. You don't have foreign invasion. You have dissuasion of that, and you don't have much crime.
Well, the Japanese didn't invade America in early 1942 because they were afraid of the 300 million gun owners in America, or how many ever guns we had in that. I mean, the United States deployed the exact same weapon against Japan that Switzerland deployed against the Nazis. Japan didn't want to come anywhere near continental United States. They probably could have, but they didn't want to come anywhere near it. They had absolutely no belief that they could take the country because of the private gun ownership of this country. I mean, it saved the U.S. against the Japanese in the Pacific War.
And Stalin also wanted to take Switzerland as well, and he informed the Prime Minister of Switzerland, we will come out 100 to 1, and the Prime Minister of Switzerland said, well, we'll just have to be 100 times better shot. So it dissuaded the Nazi Germany, dissuaded the Soviets.
And if you want an example of the other way around, France in 1935 decreed registration of guns, and the Prime Minister was none other than Pierre Laval. In 1940, the Nazis occupied France, and the armistice terms were that the French police would enforce the German army policies. The French police, who had the registration records, Pierre Laval got in charge of the government again. He was the greatest collaborationist in Europe, all of Europe, with the Nazis. And all they had to do was round up the people from the registration records. Fortunately, many French had not registered their guns. They buried them, and they had them available when the time came for resistance and for helping the allies with intelligence and sabotage and those sorts of things.
As you look back across history, and you've done a lot of research across the historical lines, have you ever seen a society that registers its weapons that it does not lead to confiscation? I mean, has there ever been a situation where registration worked without confiscation?
Well, I'm not aware of it. And ironically, when the Weimar Republic decreed registration in 1931, it included not only registration, but explicitly said that there was a power in the government to confiscate the guns if the so-called public security so required. There you had an honest registration law, didn't you? It was one that said we can not only you have to register them, but we can take them away. But other registration laws don't do that. I mean, we've got registration of long guns in New York City, for example, starting in the 60s. And they said, oh, we would never take your guns. And then in the 90s, they declare many rifles to be so-called assault weapons that are banned, and they sent letters out to the registrants saying that you get it out of our jurisdiction or we're going to come knock on your door.
Okay.
So
it's even happened here in the States.
Oh yeah, and I mean you've got the places where the jurisdictions that have declared ordinary guns to be so-called assault weapons and required them to be registered and then banned any new ones from coming in. When people know what's going on, there hasn't been much compliance, according to news reports, at least in places like California and in New York State. People know what's going on, what's in store for them, and they're reluctant to register guns for that reason.
Yeah, well, I mean, the historical perspective on it it's not pretty. I mean, registration equals confiscation. It's pretty down the same road. I mean, they're parallel paths, that's for sure.
And like you said, it defeats the purpose of having all of these gun laws because criminals who plan on using guns to commit crimes really don't care about possessing these guns legally.
I mean, can you imagine the communists and the Nazis in Weimar, Germany, registering their guns? You know, what a laugh. Give me a break. Innocent people did that. There was an Olympic champion named Alfred Flattop, who I feature in my book. He had won gold for Germany in the Athens Olympics back in 1896. He registered 3 handguns in 1932. And then when the Jews were being disarmed in Berlin, he happened to be Jewish, in 1938, he went to the police station to turn his guns in, and then they
arrested him.
Put him in Gestapo custody.
Yeah, that's the myriad of the Nazis' laws. If you didn't run afoul of this one, you're going to run afoul of that one, and well, we got you.
Right. You know, now we have 3D printing and 3D manufacturing. We are starting to move to a situation where people could possibly start manufacturing their own guns. In fact, last year, a young man put out on the internet the 3D manufacturing plans for how to actually make your own successfully fireable firearm. The Justice Department made him take it down, but 50,000 of those were downloaded. Do you think that changing technology might make it such that this whole debate is going to shift where it's completely outside of the control of government?
Well, I would be real cautious about that. I wouldn't want to fire something made under those circumstances. Back in the 80s, there was this scare about so-called plastic guns because some guy had said that he made a model of one on his computer. He never actually made one. So there's a federal law making it a felony to make plastic guns, and there's never been one that's ever been made. So there's a lot of scare tactics going on here now. Okay, I'm in an older generation, and I can't understand all the technologies that are maybe becoming more viable. But I would just be cautious of approaching that subject, and it seems to me that we're not in for some avalanche of unknown persons manufacturing guns, and we have a regime in this country of licensing for manufacturers, and they put serial numbers on guns, and they work real well. I mean, we've got just a wonderful firearms industry. So I can't predict the future, but I would just be cautious in assessing the reports of what's going on.
Well, and to play devil's advocate here, with the technological advances that not only private citizens have access to, but the government with drones, our sheriff's department has tanks. What good is a little firearm in your house going to do when the United States government comes knocking?
Well, they might do a lot of good, and I think it's been a dissuasive force against tyranny in our society. We talk about Bill of Rights freedoms. We talk about the jury box, the ballot box, and the cartridge box. And I think those institutions stay the hands of government. They make the government be more careful in what they think about doing to their citizens or their subjects. So in societies that don't have that, the governments can do anything they wish. But even in, as an example, occupied France, the Nazis were very upset that there were guns out there and they didn't know who had them. You'll see that in their internal reports. They reported how cooperative the French police were in picking up registered guns, but they were always afraid and they always had to deploy more forces there because there were unknown people who had guns. With all of their military might, I mean, you think about even at that time the military technology that was available to them, and they were afraid of Pierre with a small caliber handgun. So guns will remain a dissuasive factor against tyranny, no matter how technologically advanced the government is and how many SWAT teams it has.
Well, but Mr. Halbrook, that's one of the points, though. When Justin asked you earlier about what involvement the government should have in licensing, registration, monitoring of firearms, and then Rick brings up a point where, hey, listen, if I had a 3D printer, I could make a Glock. One of the things that Germany made both their arms manufacturers, their importers, and their citizens do is they made everybody stamp the gun with the manufacturer and put a serial number on it. Is that an overreach, or does that seem reasonable? In your response earlier was if you commit a crime with a gun, you go to prison. That sounds reasonable. Where does the slippery slope stop? One of the tools that they used against you was who manufactured and what was the serial number.
Right, and the whole idea, the way that we've tried to do the laws in this country, and I say we, I mean, I didn't do any of it, but...
No, you're the other side.
There's record keeping up to the dealer level, and there's a background check when a gun's bought from a licensed dealer, but after that, we have laws against registration of guns. Congress has passed laws in the Firearms Owners Protection Act of 1986, signed by President Reagan, even in the Brady Act, there are laws against registration of guns. The government cannot keep your records, the records on who buys guns. Once that person walks out of the gun store after the instant check, the record has to be destroyed in 24 hours. Now, there's always potential for abuse of that.
Well, the form stays on file.
The form stays in the dealer's premises. The form does not go to government premises. That would be illegal.
Okay, right on. Yeah, no, okay, sure, absolutely.
But when the Brady Act was enacted, though, and the instant check came online, I personally had argued the case that got the local law enforcement requirement for a background check declared unconstitutional. But when the instant check went online, where the FBI was conducting the checks, Janet Reno was Attorney General, and she said, we're keeping the records for 6 months. And the law said that the records had to be destroyed. And so finally Congress intervened and set the 24-hour rule that the records have to be destroyed in 24 hours. So that's worked out. So far. You always have the potential of violation of that by a rude government agency. You see how the IRS operates in regard to the
not-for-profits,
the charitable organizations, for example. So, there's dangers in this system, but it's sure better than a straight-out registration system.
Well, do you really think they're destroying them? I mean, we have the former number 4 guy at the NSA who says 100% of cell phone communication and over 80% of landline communication is sucked up by the NSA. We have all of this evidence of massive malfeasance, massive abuse by the government. Monitoring. They're interconnected with Facebook and Google. They are sucking up all of this information. They have no concern at all for the privacy.
No, it's not destroyed, Rick. It's sitting on a server somewhere. Every single one of them.
Why would we believe they say, "Oh, we'll destroy"? I mean, why?
Backed up redundantly, backed up, stored off-site on the cloud.
This $2.2 billion facility they're building in Utah is created to create an electronic dossier of every person, every credit card purchase, your medical bills, all of your Common Core, 400 points of data, all of your phone calls, everything being aligned on there so that the government at the press of a button can know absolutely everything about that person, all their phone calls, all their everything. Why would we ever dream for 1 second they wouldn't be lying about this?
Well, I've only stated what the law is, and like I said, there's potential for abuse of that. The only thing that I think keeps things going the way they are in terms of we've got all these problems, but we don't have a Gestapo. We certainly don't have a Holocaust. We have a lot of government overreach, and it's just a pendulum. History's like that, isn't it? Freedom versus slavery. It goes back to ancient Greece and Rome, the same kinds of things.
It goes right back to Benjamin Franklin. You have a republic if you can keep it.
Yeah, they people who think they know best for everybody, the social engineers, and they think they know best on every subject too, don't they? They
do.
want to dictate what the kids eat in high school. They want to dictate that you don't have guns, dictate what insurance to buy or not buy, and so that's history, and we live in a society where, fortunately, we have some institutions in America that alleviate some of that, but it's always a danger there.
When I loved what you said earlier, I was merely stating what the law is, but the government, there's always an opportunity for overreach. And if the IRS is overreaching in your life, contact Mark at 877-489-8999, because this hour is brought to you by Tax Matters Solutions. That number again is 877-489-8999. If you see the government overreaching in your life, give us a call at 969-1250. We'd love to hear your opinion as we talk with Stephen Halbrook, a Second Amendment champion, fighting for our rights to own and own guns and to carry them as well. Mr. Halbrook, we love having you on. Tell us, where do you see the future of gun control going in this country?
Yeah, and furthermore, where are the fights right now? Where are the hot zones? Where are you active? Where are you fighting?
Well, there's a very important election coming up in a few days.
Absolutely.
The Obama administration has not been able to enact any gun control. It's tried to rule by decree. I mean, the Weimar Republic had that. It was a dangerous example to set because the National Socialists took it over and really ruled by decree. There's limits to what the president has been able to do in that regard, but there's that coming up. There's local elections. There's state house races that are extremely important. The fights continue in the court system. You have a lot of resistance by lower courts to the Supreme Court decisions recognizing Second Amendment rights. So you have the enactment of these gun bans in places like New York and Connecticut, and you have courts upholding that. That litigation is going on and continuing. You have some states denying that citizens have a right to bear arms. They say, well, you can only bear arms inside your house. We don't have to have a recognition of a right to bear arms outside your house, even with licenses and permits. So there's massive resistance.
That's a big step. Which is that, Illinois?
Illinois was declared unconstitutional, and they enacted a shall issue system where law-abiding people can get guns. Your state, Indiana, has had a good law for a long time when it was rejected that the government, the police, state police, could decide whether you had a right to self-defense or not. But there are some states, and these laws have been upheld by their courts, that say that you don't have a right to bear arms unless the government says you have that right, and that would be New York and Maryland, California. So that fight continues. Fortunately, about 42 states probably have shall issue handgun carry permit systems.
42?
Something like that, yeah.
Okay.
And it's the same usual suspects that ban that right, that ban any gun they want to ban if they call it an assault weapon. And they have all these other onerous restrictions. And
you mentioned Indiana. As a personal aside, I think Indiana has what I would say a fair balance between our right to bear arms and really what is the government's responsibility and role in that. I think Indiana strikes a pretty fair balance. I don't know about your opinion, but I think we're pretty moderate when it comes to our enforcement actions.
There were a couple of court decisions that helped establish that, because your law about carry licenses had to do with whether a person stated a proper purpose. in their carry application, and there was a state, I think it's the state police, said that, well, we don't think this person is threatened, and it's not a legitimate claim of self-defense there. And the court said, no, that in itself, the right to bear arms means you have a right to defend yourself. And if you put self-defense on your application, that's good enough. This case was called Schubert versus DeBard.
That's amazing, sir, because that's exactly what they told me when I went and got my permit. That's exactly what they told me to put on there for the purpose, self-defense.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly,
right.
and the lady behind the bulletproof glass shield, that's what she told me. I asked her, I'm like, what do I put here? And she goes, self-defense. Oh, okay, yes, ma'am.
And notice they did not say, well, we're going to evaluate whether you really have a legitimate claim to self-defense, or you uniquely threatened and nobody else is, things like that.
Yeah, and that's because of that court case then.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha.
You go to some other jurisdiction, they say, oh, no, if you live in a high-crime neighborhood, that's not good enough because everybody in your neighborhood is equally threatened. You have to be uniquely threatened. And so
wow.
who gets the permits in those places? New York City? Influential people, rich people. That's who gets them.
Wow.
Oh, that's amazing.
And again, we're right back to the very concept of the powerful and the powerless. That the concept that if you're rich, if you have bodyguards, if you have people who are toting machine guns, you don't have anything to worry about. If you're living in gated communities, no problem. But if you're living in a high crime neighborhood,
oh no, you have to have a specific reason.
Yes.
Yeah, you need a reason.
So Michael Bloomberg, he's got plenty of reasons, but if you live in a very poor neighborhood that's crime-ridden, you don't have a reason.
That's amazing.
Exactly. You know, there was recently there was a couple of people who were able to penetrate the perimeter of the White House, and there was this huge hullabaloo. Oh no, the president isn't safe enough. The president isn't safe enough. He was never in any way in any harm at all, nor any possibility of harm. But everyone was in a panic. What about his safety? My question is, what about our safety? What about people who are living by the border in Mexico and it's been taken over by drug cartels and they're killing people left and right? They're saying, we're not doing enough to protect our president. What's he doing to protect us?
You go to the poor neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., and there's no gun permits available to them. They make it very expensive even to register a gun to have it in your own home. We're litigating that right now in the Court of Appeals in D.C.
Good.
The fact that you're a poor person, you live in poverty, and you've got to pay all this money and go down to the police station multiple times to register guns just to have them. I mean, the whole system is motivated to prevent people from exercising their right to even keep guns in their own homes.
Yeah, in D.C. especially, yeah, and it's amazing. Well, I wish you the best on that. I mean, you got to win. You know, you're litigating it out in the courts, and we wish you the best. I mean, you got to strike a balance.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
And as far as striking a balance, to me, the Constitution is very clear. We have the right.
Shall not be infringed.
Shall not be infringed. Period.
It's pretty clear.
And end of story. And so, myself personally, when I look at the future of 3D printed weapons, I rejoice. I'm happy about it. I personally, I think it's great. I say less control over the government because, again, it's just like saying, well, we're only going to keep the permit for 24 hours and then we're going to destroy it. We're going to keep everything else. We're going to have all your credit card purchases. We're going to have absolutely everything about you.
Your signed form.
Oh, yeah. But your registration for a gun, we'll get rid of that. Yeah.
You know, it's legal to make a gun yourself. You don't have to have a license. There's no record keeping required. You can make your own gun.
So if I had a CNC machine, I could manufacture my own handgun if I wanted to.
Absolutely, you could, and it would be completely legal. The only time the regulation comes into being is if you're engaged in the business of manufacturing for distribution. So you can make all the guns you want for yourself, but if you make it into a business, then there's a federal license that's required.
Well, thank you, sir, for being on with us this morning.
Truth, justice, and the American way. We are the voices of dissent.